Hey, I'm going to come to you today with two videos on clearing of the plain. This is going to be Chapter 9, which is the final chapter, the Nadir of the Indigenous Health, 1886 to 1991. 1891. And also the second video will be kind of on the conclusion chapter. So yeah, let's get into Chapter 9 of Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk, which I've been buddy reading with Sean the Book Maniac. And basically, I do this video and then I do the Voxer message to Sean. Hi, Sean. Where I basically hopefully do a little bit more condensed version of what I'm doing here, because here is just me, I guess, me thinking things through or going through the chapter and seeing what that brings up. So yeah, we've had the native rebellion kind of around the Battleford region, where there's very public executions done with maximum of publicity to basically impress upon the native population that we will crush you. And what happens after Battleford is more repression. And it's interesting that it targets more the native population than it does the Métis population, who've been having sort of Louis Riel. That kind of the Red River Rebellion has been happening at the same time. This book does not deal with that at all, other than to note that when it comes time to imprison and execute people, that it is far more the native population that the government seems to focus upon. Dewdney, Edward Dewdney, the chief kind of official in the area, have come up with basically a policy of reward and punishment, where basically the loyal native groups are the ones that are seen loyal are the ones that are rewarded with livestock and assistance, while the rebel communities, they're having their annuities, which actually I'm not quite sure what annuities means, withheld, and also their horses and firearms confiscated, which is like part of what they need to actually survive. Pass system starts to be implemented after this, where you are on the reserve, and the only way you can leave the reserve is through the permission of the Indian agents, the officials of the time. And so furthermore, you can't go out to actually try and hunt game. The police actually protest against this, saying this isn't really a legal thing. This is a violation, a breach of trust. But regardless, they actually do. They do enforce this thing. So we're cramming the native population onto reserves, and they're not letting them off it. They also Big Bear's band, one of the more rebellious bands, they just break it up. They split it up and put it they put them in different reserves and stuff like that. They are cut off economically from the outside world. No produce can be sold without permission of the Department of Indian Agents. And it's basically just subsistence farming, which results in poor population that is completely alienated from the outside world. This is a period where we're going into a nadir of the demographics. Like, there's just less and less native peoples. There's like they talk about it as we end up with 1/3 of the population less. Now, this might not all be people dying. There's definitely a lot of reports of people basically fleeing to the United States to get away from these repressive practices, and because that there are further cuts and rations are further withheld, so people just can't live like this, and they leave. They also renounce their native status, just to try and escape that way. So 1/3 of the population just disappears, and Daschuk does say in these sections we can't really know precisely how many people died, because this is also a time when we go from the 1870s, where it was tuberculosis was relatively rare in the population, to it suddenly by the 1884 you get TB ravaging the population, and this does seem to all kind of center around the malnutrition, the overcrowding on the reserves, exposure, poor sanitation, and the oppressive government policies that are keeping people in in poverty. Um, there's and Dasyuk notes in here that if you're a Native person during this time, the less actual oversight, less contact you have with the Department of Indian Affairs, the less likely, the healthier you are going to be. We also have the thing of that. There's all these schools getting put up where you're sending children to school, but these schools are kind of vectors of disease for the kids in them, and indeed you get the Thunderchild and Sweetgrass reserves who refused to send their children to school, so the government's withheld rations until they actually kind of they forced them to send the children to these schools, schools where raw milk gets continued to get served to kids long past the point where children, white settler children are getting pasteurized milk, thus more exposure to TB. And Dasyuk goes into his whole thing about kind of the Sundance religious ceremony, which seems to be kind of a kind of a native religious ceremonies that are kind of based on kind of like health concerns. But he also notes that what's been happening in the U.S. was something called the Ghost Dance. And forgive me, this is just stuff that I'm using my details from what I gleaned from Dasyuk. I do not have all this down, but that it started with in Nevada, Paiute, and it started as kind of a very kind of a pacifistic kind of right living to bring kind of prosperity back to native peoples, but it gets its kind of most tragic and radical expression with the Lakota Sioux, where there has been what's depressingly familiar to what I've been talking about with Canadian Native peoples, where there has been disease, crop failure, drought, and the American government is like cuts the rations to these peoples by half, and then cuts them again. At which point there is actual violent rebellion, and the Ghost Dance becomes basically a prayer for the annihilation of white annihilation and the return of Indian supremacy, is how Dasyuk puts it. And this freaks out the settler population in the American government. Sitting Bull gets killed while they attempt to arrest him, and we have the Wounded Knee massacre, where 200 men, women, and children are butchered by government. I think it's government forces. This, as Dasyuk notes, happens exactly at the same point that the American native population is reaching its nadir. It's like this is the worst. This is where they're, this is the lowest they get in population numbers. Now, how does Canadian government respond to all the stuff that's happening in the U.S.? They get worried about the native population in Canada. They're basically they seal off the reserves. They disarm all American natives coming into the country. Collecting duty on their ponies or turning them back if they can. And the police they put police at the border when you get rumors of a war dance at Turtle Mountain, North Dakota, and stuff like that. And actually, the Ghost Dance didn't actually spread to Canada as a thing. They was much more interested in kind of the Sundance thing. The government was like, use this opportunity to start really suppressing other religious practices. And like, this is 1895, that, because Native peoples go from being kind of like nuisance to being perceived as actual threats to the property and lives of the white settlers. as I said, like we don't really know what the precise number of indigenous people who died post 1885. A third of the population dies, disappears, not dies, disappears. It's just like, oh, suddenly a third of that population from 1885 is suddenly gone. And this nadir here is what Dashuk puts forward as basically the origin of the chasm that still remains between the mainstream Canada and Western Canadians, Native First Nations people that continues on to this day. There's 15,000 Native people remaining in the prairies, and they're swamped in a sea of immigrants, and they're basically marginalized. No one really cares about them other than reserves are seen as reservoirs of disease, and that might threaten the white settlers around. So it's much more about protecting the white settlers than it is actually alleviating the horrible conditions on these reserves. Things, which honestly, whenever something happens with Native peoples, it's when it makes trouble for the rest of us is when it suddenly becomes a concern for mainstream Canada. It's not the ongoing horribleness as it is. And a lot of the ill health gets defined, Dashuk says, by the growing residential school system, where overcrowding combines with the already implanted, like the TB they've been exposed to. But it's one of these things of like, they have a thing here of the Quail Industrial School, where Father Huguenard considers his tenure successful with a 20% death rate of his students. I'm trying to think of any school that would say, "Oh, we only lost 20% of our students during the time I was during the time I ran the school." Wasn't that great? It's just like, holy crap! It is in this period that the idea that Native people are hereditarily more susceptible to TB comes into force, and it's a theory that gets carried right up like 1922 past, where you have Dr. R.G. Ferguson's study saying that the natives have much more susceptible to TB. This only gets disproved kind of later when you have a European population of European Jews shoved into the Warsaw Ghetto and them having such high levels of susceptibility to TB. It's not because they're Jewish people, it's because how they're being treated, just as the Native people. It's not because they are susceptible, it's how they're being treated. But this kind of putting this mindset in, it's like, oh, well, that's just Native people, they're more susceptible to disease. Dashuk says, like, this is basically completes the marginalization of the Native population from Canadian society. They're marginalized economically, and they're marginalized, just marginalized physically, shoved onto things, and where they say, oh, all that disease, that's hereditary. That has nothing to do with how the Canadian government has created, Canada has created this environment, which of course is going to result in, disease and things. And indeed, the TB situation doesn't improve on reserves until post World War II, when with the introduction of antibiotics, which actually brings it under control. And Dashuk notes, like, recent studies have showed TB is not hereditary, but it's the ecological factors and the inequity of health outcome. These inequities of health outcomes continues to this very present day. And we have the whole thing on a fellow named Charcoal, who was wanted for killing his wife and a police officer who tried to arrest him, and he had TB, and they had to hang him while he in a chair because he was basically so close to dying from the TB, which is just like indignity after dignity. I don't know. So yeah, basically, so after rebelling under the all this inhumane, terrible treatment. Things actually get worse. They died or fled to the U.S., led to this demographic nadir, marginalized, and set on a path of terrible health to this very day. So that is the chapter 9. That's chapter 9 of like, this is their lowest point, and this lowest point, not uncoincidentally, happens with them entering into a government with an agreement with the Canadian government, which is the direct result of that. It's like, why are they at such a low point? It's because they tried to rebel against the Canadian government, and the Canadian government squashed them down and set up the systems that, in some way, system that still persists to this day in Canada. So that's chapter 9. I'll press stop, and then I'm going to do the conclusion of Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk. All right. See you in a second if you want more.